morning, buenos dias, bom dia. Shall we start? Okay, we have some logistics to update you before we start this session. I'm very glad to be here with you all. I just have one comment. I didn't bring my glasses, so I don't know if I'll be able to read what's there, so apologize for that. But Andrew and Christian are there, so I know they'll save me. So general information, one important information for today is that we changed the reception. It's gonna be at 2:30 p.m. right after the afternoon session. The afternoon session is only for government authorities and the MDRC project staff. We're gonna have an internal working session. So after lunch, those who are not government or MDRC are free to do whatever you need to do, and then come back for our final reception at 2:30 downstairs, same place. Okay. And now I cannot read most of it. We have some virtual guests this morning. I would like you to read, Andrew, because honestly, without my glasses.
No worries, Renata. I've gotten
Go
used
ahead.
to it now.
Thank you. I knew you. Yeah.
So again,
see, more people need glasses here.
No, thank you all for returning here. If this is your third day, and to those joining online, we're really glad to have you. A couple of quick announcements for those who are online again. Please make sure to keep yourself muted throughout the duration of today's session. If at any point in time you do wish to raise a question or a comment, please enter it into the chat and our Zoom operators will be able to direct your question. The morning program for this workshop, as Renata said, is open. However, after the lunch break, this includes those online and in the room, we will continue in a closed session. So just to take note of that. And there is also a new link for those who are invited to the afternoon session online. So just take particular note of that. And again, if you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to the two emails that are on your screen. For folks who are here again in person in Los Angeles, masks are available upon request. We kindly ask again, if you are here, to please complete your pre-entry COVID questionnaire. It's very important to all of us here so we don't get in trouble. That goes with your exit questionnaire. If you have not completed your entry questionnaire, just let a member of our team know. We have a paper copy for you to complete. And again, this is on a daily basis. So if you've completed one already, you still need to complete one again this morning. Simultaneous translation is offered for all activities. So if you're here in the room and you wish to use it, now is a good time to take out your portable device and start connecting into the system. Please use your headphones and keep your connected device on mute. Restrooms are just out the front door to the left, and the guest Wi-Fi information, if you need it, is located on one of these cards on the desks in front of you. And with that, Renata, back over to you.
Thank you. Do we have Paul Fekete online already? I'm going to provide a few updates on our MDRC project, and I will just try to contextualize again, because yesterday you had a presentation from USAID and ANSI about the project as well. But now I'd like to welcome Paul Fekete, team leader, acting head for the Center for Economics and Market Development, Bureau for Development, Democracy and Innovation, U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and my apologies for not being able to be with everyone in Los Angeles, but it's still nice to be able to participate online. I'm Paul Fekete. I'm a senior international trade advisor, as you said, with USAID's Center for Economics and Market Development, the office that oversees some of the work that will be part of the conversation today. I'm looking forward to the session today on advancing the implementation of cross-sectoral foundational GRP and regional cooperation in Latin America workshop, which is organized by the Medical Device Regulatory Convergence, the MDRC activity. MDRC is a joint effort between USAID and the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, the Advanced Medical Technology Association, or ANVIMED, and the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence under the umbrella of the Standards Alliance. The Standards Alliance is USAID's and ANSI's public-private partnership that addresses challenges that partner countries face on standards and national quality infrastructure. USAID's investment in standards programming recognizes the significant adverse effects that domestic regulations that do not align with international standards can generate. This includes dilution of economic gains from trade, fragmentation of supply chains, dispersion of domestic growth potential, or reduction of national consumer safety. The adverse effects can be more severe in the healthcare space, as standards can limit patients' access to quality and safe medical technologies. In some extreme cases, ineffective frameworks can fail to weed out dangerous products endangering people's lives. MDRC results from the need to support partner countries in their response to COVID-19. As the pandemic unraveled in early 2020, USAID saw many medtech-related regulations, including those related to standards, come online and spread throughout the globe. Production of urgently needed medical products, which generally require global inputs, was dangerously coming to a halt. Many of them were documented by the World Trade Organization, including duplication of rigorous local testing that could lead to delays and uncertainty for suppliers, an unclear process for regulatory approval of diagnostics that could lead to diagnostics of varying quality, inefficient and overly complex regulatory systems slow down activation of clinical trials and hamper the adoption of results. Duplication of standards and multiple regulatory authorities responsible for medical goods that could increase complexity and drive up costs, including for developing country contract development and manufacturing organizations. And a lack of coordination among border agencies that could lead to unnecessary delays, in particular for transit through third countries. MDRC addresses these and other challenges by supporting the adoption of international benchmarks, such as those developed by the World Health Organization or the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum. The approach is based on collaboration with your governments to identify priorities for technical assistance. USAID does not, nor MDRC, embrace tactics meant to impose views that counter your democratic governance. Unlike others, our technical assistance comes without ties and seeks to promote true, open, and free market values. Our projects also embrace long-term views of self-sustainable economic growth, not of economic dependency. That's why MDRC works with partner countries to set long-lasting foundations that regulators can leverage to address future challenges successfully, such as those that the digital transformation will bring to healthcare systems and healthcare products. More broadly, the MDRC's advocacy of good regulatory practices, or GRPs, promotes regulatory quality through greater transparency, objective analysis, and accountability, contributing to our partner country's ability to achieve its public health policy objectives, while at the same time facilitating medical technology trade, investment, and economic growth. GRPs, when established in law, also bolster public confidence in governance, attracts foreign investors, and keeps them engaged, knowing that open, predictable, and legitimate processes help guarantee that all views may be heard. Such processes also help consider impacts on different stakeholders, such as small businesses. Attention to small business impacts will also help nurture new medical technology and help foster innovative solutions to create a more sustainable and equitable economic future for everyone. I hope that everyone has a very productive working session for the balance of the day, and thank you for letting me be a part of the session.
Thank you very much, Paul, for joining us this morning. Thank you for this excellent opening remarks for our session today. Thank you. So this panel, as I mentioned in the beginning, will be open to attendance by all the members of the coalition. And we are glad to have a representative from each country in person that will overview the country's efforts to date to implement GRP, good regulatory practice, and what each country hopes to achieve with respect to the implementation of GRPs over the coming years. The Standards Alliance Phase 2, this project is a public-private partnership between USAID, you just heard from them, the American National Standards Institute, represented here by Jessica, and you're gonna hear from her in a few minutes. The second phase of the Standards Alliance involves collaboration with the US private sector partners, US government experts, and USAID eligible countries and regions over a 5-year project. MDRC has partner countries across Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The Standards Alliance Phase 2, MDRC, builds up and updates the results from the first phase of the Standards Alliance in Latin America, shifting the geographic scope to include Brazil, and introduce the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence in the medical technology sector, with a permanent technical secretariat to increase the Standards Alliance activity and organization to a higher order of magnitude. The MDRC project countries in Latin America, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, here represented today, and Peru. MDRC regional objectives in Latin America are foster implementation of foundational GRPs that codify good governance in the regulatory process, focusing on transparency, predictability, accountability, and international convergence. Foster implementation of medical device sector-specific convergence in regulations, standards, and conformity assessment to reduce unnecessary non-tariff barriers. Establish the novel Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence with the vision of one standard, one test, accepted everywhere, to accelerate private-public cooperation in support of medical device regulatory convergence through the use of international standards. And last but not least, assist customs authorities in understanding and following the important criteria and policies set by the health authorities addressing COVID-19. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to pass the floor to Gianluca Lorenzon. Thank you again for being here with us. We are really delighted to have you here. Gianluca is the Secretary for Competition, Advocacy, and Competitiveness, Secretary for Competition, Advocacy, and Competitiveness in Brazil. Gianluca?
Thank you, Renata. Thank you so much to everyone. Again, it's such a pleasure to be here. And today we're going to have the opportunity to talk for a bit longer time. And I think this is a great opportunity to exchange. And I'm so happy to have this opportunity together with Lina to be able to present to you guys a bit of what we are seeing as GPR initiatives in Brazil. So I don't know, I sent you the presentation. Is it?
Probably there.
Oh yeah, there you go. See, that's a lot of productivity. So okay, so let me first start talking a little bit about my department and exactly what my secretariat does within the Brazilian federal government. So SEAI, as we say, answers directly to the Deputy Ministry for Productivity and Competitiveness. And our goal usually is to monitor regulation historically for purpose of competition, right? To ensure that, that the regulation in Brazil does not distort competition, create market barriers or trade barriers, and does not, privilege some over the others. So historically, that has been the work, but in the last couple of years, CI has been moving from that position to become much more closer to something as an oversight body for regulation, when it comes not only to competition, but also to good regulatory practices. But that's a work in progress, right? We are still not close to what OIRA is, for instance, in the United States, and not as close as we would like to be when it comes to oversight bodies on regulatory affairs. But we're moving there, and something that's very interesting for us is that it's about steps. Because yes, one thing that matters a lot is to have laid down in a presidential decree that's our duties and that's our functions and that's something that we're going to implement. But there's another issue here that it's also to have the expertise to do that, to construct a relationship of confidence, of trust, and of open working relationship with all the regulators. And we're building that because for us, it's also about building institutions. So this is just a quick disclosure before I enter. So it does not appear that I'm trying to sell you guys that we are the Brazilian OIRA and I'm here to, and I have the same authority that some counterparts in other countries could have. Well, boom. See, we begin in the morning and Portuguese enters. We have been a crazy morning. Actually, I'm just gonna share with you guys one of the reasons why I've been so happy this morning, although it may not seem. We have implemented for the first time in Brazil is equivalent to a 10% reduction on tariffs across all sectors this morning, because we it's a lot. You know, Brazil was was the only country in Mercosur and is one of the very few countries in the world that would put the costs of ports, how do you say this in English? You know, we call it capatazia, which means, you know, the costs of you know, of handling the ships when they come to the ports and all the importation handling, that will be under the tariffs scope. So that will result in a 10% increase in tariffs. Was a way to, you know, to close markets and to increase barriers. This morning, after decades long fight, we have been able to remove that in a presidential decree. So it's equivalent to a reduction on 10% across all sectors on tariffs for imports, which will benefit the very sectors that we're discussing here today on medical devices. So we're very, very happy. And this is why I've been up this morning and we're answering the press. And then my boss wants one more brief, one more thing to say. You guys know how it goes. So sorry about that, but I think this is very related to the topic of our discussion today. So I thought it would be great to mention that. So let's talk a little about, I like to work with data and KPIs, right? I think this is wonderful. And the number one KPI for us is the PMR index from OECD, which is the product market regulation index. One of the reasons that I like this so much, and we try to emulate this internally in Brazil, and this is why I mentioned Monday that we were making a system of rating systems for new regulations that are going to have the gold, silver, and bronze regulations. Is because it's very actionable, right? You know exactly what you have to do. For instance, when you take a look at PMRs, 1,008 questions, and you know exactly what you're doing. So it's questions like yes or no, A or B. This is really helpful for all the regulators and for us as well, because we can have a pipeline of discussions. The only downside here for me is that it only comes out 5 years, every 5 years. So that kind of makes it hard to create a sense of reward for the regulators. It would be very nice if you could have more of those indexes in the region as well. So that's something I also love to work. So Brazil is the one before last, which is very sad, right? So as I mentioned to you guys on Monday, we have the highest cost of regulation in the world and the one before last on quality, according to the OECD. And when it comes to the Brazilian cost, which is defined as the average cost of production in Brazil compared to the average country on OECD, we're talking about 1.5 trillion reais, which is equivalent of $300 billion US dollars a year, which are that producing something in Brazil is more expensive in comparison with the average OECD country. And we're not talking here about, you know, China, Southeast Asia. We're talking about the average OECD country, which is, you know, a richer country has more cost of transactions, taxes, and so on. And that $1.5 trillion, which is 22% of our GDP, almost 200 billion reais is due to regulatory inefficiency. So, you know, this is the cost of regulatory inefficiency in Brazil, and something that also has been first in history estimated by this government. But what have been done, right? I think this is really important for us, is to imagine what have we done to address this and how have been working. So some of the main initiatives, we started with ProReg in 2007, even in the leftist government, it continued to develop, but it really took off, I guess, in the Temer administration, and now it speeded up in our administration. In 2018, we have the first RIA guide, Regulatory Impact Analysis Guide, was at the time addressed by the Palace itself. And then in 2019, we started with the Regulatory Agencies Law that cleared the way to have a clear regulatory process of decision for our 12 agencies at federal level. And then we have, still in 2019, the Economic Freedom Act, that laid down a whole new directive of how regulation should work and how RA should apply to all regulators in Brazil, which, as I mentioned to you, by Monday, we are still estimating, but just at the federal level are about 200 different regulatory authorities, which is very scary. Can you imagine like having to deal with all of that to come to Brazil? It's really bad for us. The Economic Freedom Act has a lot of subset of presidential decrees. I mentioned the full federal regulatory review. We have already concluded the analysis of 74,000 regulations, and we have, we have banished into non-existent 31,000 as of the beginning of this year. And we have to finalize, there are some regulations in Brazil, especially in the health sector, but it's more for public health. They are enforced since the empire. So, it's a lot of work. We have the federal licensing review, the international standardization review, and the RE presidential decree, which really took off. I always like to bring the decree 10.229 because it says that those 5 organizations that you see on the screen, their regulation can supersede the Brazilian regulation if it becomes obsolete, right? And these are very consensus organizations, but we want to increase that list. And I think that this is kind of the opportunity to be open to suggestions about other organizations that we can have. Basically, how this works is you can come to Brazil and you can say to the regulator, you see your regulation is obsolete. It's stopping me to release a product or a service in Brazil that it's very well developed around the world. So I want to use this international regulation instead of your domestic one. And that's how it goes, basically. Continue a little about our GRP practices. I guess it froze. Okay, there are a decree that came out in 2020, and it comes into force 1 year ago in April, and it's a work in progress. We have to convince the regulators about the importance. We have to make sure that there is expertise in Brazil, and this is why it's so important. It's a challenge for regulators because, above all, it's a change in cultural, organizational culture. And so this is really important for us, but we're fighting. I'm trying to go faster, but I think that it froze again. Can I? Okay, there you go. Some characteristics of the regulatory impact analysis in Brazil. It's about being mandatory. It's about involving public and stakeholders' participation, which are really important for us. We're trying to encourage data-oriented RIAs. I think this is the dream for us, and to have sure that the procedures have a proportionality with the impact of the regulation. Continue down for the next phase. We have also implemented already some of the aspects of the US-Brazil protocol on good regulatory practices. We have the single regulatory website already working with gov.br/reg, and we're very happy about it because I think that's going to be a data center for all the regulation in the future. And now we're just waiting for the presidential decree it's weird because we have Brazilian regulators here, right? But we're waiting for the presidential decree to enforce the centralization of this website. We are also going to have mandatory public consultations. It's in the work. We are we're disseminating, let's say, the quantitative methods for RA. We have periodic review of regulations, and we are launching advisory groups to help all the regulators on the implementation of the US-Brazil protocol. Finally, how is this implementation going? We are on our way to release new courses, and we have including done some partnerships, international ones, and this is very important for us. So we are here I'm here personally to collect as many as possible, contacts of people that have the expertise to disseminate this kind of knowledge in Brazil. There has been done some pilot projects on RAA, especially for what we call direct administration, which is the ministries. Those regulators, they have so much more trouble and more difficulties when implementing RAA because they have been historically more political. Those regulations are more political decided, right? They're not as technical as the agencies. And we have made available some tools, including CalHag, which is, it's a general calculator for regulatory costs. As we go eventually. Yeah, that's what I just mentioned. CalHag, which is, it's a very easy to use calculator for regulatory costs that we develop. So any regulator can use that, and we can start estimating how much it costs. Can I change it here?
No, it's not connected.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
just showing you.
Then we have, the website that I already mentioned is going to be able to have all the regulatory norms in here, which also makes we're very happy. We have launched 2 complete guides so far on it, and we're about to launch the 3rd. We're very, very excited about it. And all of them that we're going to do brings me to finally, I promise I'm finishing, and I'm behind my time. We have the bi-monthly encounter for federal regulators. And yes, there you go. We're going to have the RIA week, the Regulatory Impact Assessment Week. It's going to be from June 21 to 24th. You guys are all invited. I know it's hard to come to Brazil without prior notice, but we're very excited about it, right? And this is going to be very important for us because we're going to have a full week with the discussion for the first time on this aspect in Brazil. We're going to put a cent in front, and this is the idea of how we are seeing this, and so we're very excited, very, very excited. And I guess we have been able to do so with the partnership of different organizations, and we are very thankful for that. So just to finish and close my presentation, I'd like to bring what are our challenges, right? What are like the main challenges when we are approaching GRP in Brazil? So first of all, I think there's an issue of institutionalization to make sure that this is a process that continues within each and every department. The agencies are always easier, but we have all the 180 other regulators. Make sure that this is not something that is exclusive to some people, and when they leave that department, because that happens a lot in government, they move from one department to the other, that continues within the structure and how the authority operates. That's very important. And there's also the issue of cultural change. As I mentioned to you, it's very hard for sometimes for the regulators to understand that they have some constraints, and that what they're going to regulate cannot be a personal choice. It cannot be a personal decision. It cannot be, your individual assessment. It has to be an assessment done through a process with public participation, which is the first challenge, because it's very hard for some regulators to do that. They're afraid of what kind of response they might get, and transparency overall. But it's what we always say to the regulators. It's yes, you can have public participation, and then it may not come out as you want, but it makes the regulation better, and it makes the regulation with greater authority. And we can see later that if the regulation ends up in court, we know that helps, right? That you did everything as you should. We also have one of the biggest challenges for us are here is quantitative methodologies and data assessment. It's very hard for Brazil. It's most of the Brazilian regulators are lawyers. I'm a lawyer, so I can make this criticism. We're not very data oriented. And a lot of our colleagues say, "Oh, why did you choose to go to law school?" Why? Because I hated math. And you know that's true, right? And that's bad because we need more engineers, we need more managers, we need more scientists, we need more, you know, those STEAM approach people inside the administration. But as of right now, the best careers for being to work in the public sector in Brazil are the lawyer-oriented ones, the legal-oriented ones. So in most positions of regulatory affairs in Brazil, they're filled up by lawyers, and they don't have this background. So we have to change that. Of course, this is one of the minor causes for that. But there's also the whole cultural and, you know, other perceptions. But this is going to be the biggest one. This is going to be from far the biggest one. This is why cost benefit analysis is so not known in Brazil and has been one of our major concerns to bring that methodology to Brazil. Because for us, RA is about methodology. It's about technicism and about, you know, how analytical you can make it. And also we're going to have a very interesting process of making ex post analysis. And it has to be done at least, very curious because each regulation has to conduct at least one until the end of this year. But I guess that is it. Thank you so much, guys, for the opportunity again. And we're going to be here for further discussions later.
Thank you, Gianluca. This is excellent. Thank you very much. I'm also a lawyer, so you can imagine how long does it take for me and Steven Bipe, an engineer, to get to an agreement. Thank you so much. This was excellent. We have time for questions at the end, but now I'd like to. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Lina Valencia, Director of Governance, Human Rights and Peace, Colombia National Planning Department. Thank you so much for being here with us. We are delighted to have Colombia represented here.
Thank you, Renata. I'm pleased to be here. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Lina Valencia, as you said. I'm the Director of Governance, Human Rights and Peace at the National Planning Department from Colombia. And I'll be doing my presentation in Spanish. It's okay for you. Okay. Quiero contarles un poquito.
So let me tell you a little bit about what we have been doing in the country regarding regulatory policies. For us, this is something that is relatively new. It started in 2012 after a series of recommendations that were given by the OECD. That's when we started working on this. So I brought a presentation, I brought some slides to tell you what we do in the National Planning Department. But Gianluca, you have already explained it. But anyway, the planning department, in a way, it's a technical arm of the national government in my country. Colombia has a full cabinet of ministers, but we play the technical mainstream role because we accompany the different entities regarding the development planning of the country and also in terms of budgetary affairs. Our role is characterized because many times there are certain subjects like this one here that due to its cutting or mainstreaming nature, it's difficult for a single agency to take over. So that's why the planning department has been the leader for regulatory improvement and making certain that it becomes institutionalized. So very briefly, let me tell you how we understand this. I would like to show how from a cyclical perspective, we see this in an integral way. And let me tell you about the specific progress that we have had, the breakthroughs. And as of recently, we have been doing a very interesting reflection because we are trying to find a way in which to use regulatory policies as a way not only to increase productivity of the nation, but also the efficiency of the state as well as how it increases trust towards the institutions by the citizens. We have many political standards, tools, guidelines, so I'd like to touch upon some of them very briefly. So very quickly, stage by stage, the planning stage, as the name states it, the idea is to identify the action for the government to intervene through a regulation. And here even though it is a cross-cutting principle, transparency is something that is very important. Starting from the planning stage, our intention is to communicate the interested parties, the stakeholders, what is it that we're planning to do and how. So the tool here is a regulatory schedule. In Colombia, the ministries must publish their regulatory agendas on October the 31st. So on October 31st, this is made public so all of the stakeholders can be consulted. The agenda of the ministries is open for feedback until December the 31st. And then January the 5th, that's when we send the agenda to the president, the final one. So starting from the planning stage, we are involving all of the stakeholders. Now, during the design stage, when we look at how we justify the needs that we identify in the previous stages, we need to define how to make the interventions in the best way, the best alternatives to do so. As you have mentioned, in the case of Brazil, the regulatory impact assessment is the tool that we apply. In terms of the assessment, there are important breakthroughs we've had. First, we were able to regulate it for the issuance or the editing of all technical regulations. Anything that is enacted requires a regulatory impact assessment. There are two different types according to the objective of those technical RIAs. And we also have training courses and tools that are given to the stakeholders. They're very popular. People from the told us that they really like the tools that we offer because anybody can use them, and we do. And we review them periodically so that they remain relevant for all of the actors. And as of recently, there was a decree that granted the National Planning Department the power to verify the quality of that regulatory impact assessment of the entities. So when the entities change a technical regulation, we, as the National Planning Department, we are the ones who make certain that there's quality all throughout the exercise. Of course, there are certain challenges we face, and I hope we will be able to discuss them during the afternoon. But anyway, in each one of them, we have had some breakthroughs. And in terms of public consultation, this is something that's always present to achieve transparency and have all the stakeholders involved and engaged. I must say that long discussions have been held so as to give compliance to OECD's recommendations, but in our country, it is compulsory. It is mandatory to publish it. And we have different guidelines for public consultation that have been developed by our department, and they're being updated as of right now. And we also want to make them as efficient as possible and that they're very much aligned to the changes. The main tool that we offer there for public consultation is the unique public consultation systems. And this is where we speak of regulation, but also there are some places in which we share public policy documents. Those documents are special for different situations in Colombia, but SUCOP, we disseminate the regulatory impact assessment. We also share the assessment, the results, the regulatory programs, as well as any projects. And even though SUCOP is something new, there are many entities that are now adhering to it. 23 entities all throughout the land participate and publish through SUCOP now. And we have 12,000 users who interact with the system. It was launched in 2020. And right now we are making an important effort because, speaking now of the challenges, right? SUCOP is what has not been so far, or rather how to say it, a decree is about to be approved, so it becomes mandatory for everybody to publish through SUCOP, because even though it is compulsory within the country, the ministries can use their websites. And this can cause a lot of problems because we are not completely aligned. The idea is to have everything published through SUCOP. So the presidential decree is going to make it compulsory for everybody to publish their agendas here. Now, I cannot speak about how the quality is reviewed or how the publications are also analyzed, because the planning department is not directly involved right now working on that. And I assume that this is something that is easy for everybody to understand. How we review, how we disclose information, it is closely related to public consultation, and it can help with transparency and access to information regarding everything we issue as regulators for the regulations, so everybody's in the know. Many times we say that when people ignore a regulation, that's not an excuse for people to miss it. So dissemination is very important. And now about ex post analysis, this is paramount for creating evidence and indicators. So in our department, we are working in the ex post analysis and assessment because we wish to start going deeper into this. And as of recently, an important breakthrough has been achieved because we now have a definition of what needs to be done periodically in all of our technical regulations, considering the type of assessment. At least 5 years, an ex post assessment of the regulation is now required. And since this starts from a standard that became enforceable in 2018, retroactively, this ex post assessment is also required. So by 2024, we need to have done all of the assessment of all of the technical regulations starting of 2005. So a lot of work has to be done to have everything assessed. And we have guidelines, training classes online and info charts. And with the regulatory convergence project, as of last year, we started working, no, it was not last year, but we started working with the evaluation of 6 regulations, and right now we are including two more specific ones. Some other efforts are being made, and even though they respond to some of the stages, let me also share very briefly that we are working with the institutionalization of the regulatory governance cycle. We believe that is something of the essence. As I said, important progress has been made, especially for technical regulations, but as we discussed with Susan yesterday, we have a great concern to standardize all of the processes for all of the stages and for all of the types of regulatory acts and managerial acts. We want to take advantage of this regulatory framework, and the guidelines are being updated to help with this to move it along as well. The discussions are very much connected to standardize, having certain flexibility as well, because from a sectoral perspective, there are many things that have to be custom made according to the land and to the people. Our country is quite diverse. It is as big as Mexico, or not as big as Brazil, but each land is different, each territory is landed, and therefore the regulations have to be customized. So we need to be flexible. And the second great tool is the one to create capabilities. We have done a lot of work to convey the message, to tell the public officials, to tell the entities about why this is important, why do we need to work on this. We have done this with some relative success. We started with the strategy for capacity building in 2021. During the first semester, we had 73 entities involved, and for the second one, we had 224. And right now we are closing the first semester of 2022, and we hope that the results will be much more ambitious in the future. As I said, SUCOP, which is our portal for the publications, it's our favorite project, it's our pet. We hope it will continue working as it has. And we have an observatory for regulatory improvement. We're working on that. And according to our mission, we have the idea to create more evidence to make this better and better. We are strengthening our observatory. We're producing an enormous amount of regulations and standards. According to analysis that we did last year, around 9.4 standards a day are produced, substantial ones. Somebody from Brazil said that you had more than 200 regulators. Well, we are not as many, but we do produce a lot, and if things don't have standards, they need to get them really quickly. It's what's in right now in Colombia. So we need to work on how to keep up with that. And we also have a regulatory impact analysis calculator to share the experiences, because we have it for the technical regulations, but as I mentioned, it's also meant for the integral governance cycle. We want to use it for all types of managerial administrative acts. And finally, to conclude, the challenges. Oh, no, I forgot. In terms of good practices, we have a committee for regulatory improvement. 7 entities participate. We are constantly working to see how to go deeper along with them in terms of these policies. And last year, we had a contest of good regulatory practices with 7 different categories. It went really well. Right now, we have an open call for a second edition of this contest. This is something that was very well received. And during the first contest, we are creating, with a group of winners of the first contest, we are consolidating a community of good regulatory practices for the country. So the idea is that with the winners of the second contest, and whoever wants to join in, of course, we will go deeper into this matter. And we are also creating some articles for regulatory improvement. We're going to publish an analysis of what we've done so far and of the challenges to have regulatory improvement. Where's my slide? Just 1 second. What are the challenges? Very quickly, capacity building. That's very important. And it's not only for technical capacities, but also mentality changes. How do we convince people of why this is important and why things has to be done? We also need to create more data to have more evidence, more indicators. We are very much involved now with the regulatory impact assessment and the export assessment, and to see how to create more evidence-based data, and also how to use regulatory impact assessment so as to be able to standardize it. That's also relevant, and also to create more strength in our institutions so that good practices can be adopted in the public agenda, because in spite of the fact that this is something which is very much discussed internationally nowadays, sometimes within the countries like in ours, there's not much awareness. We don't want it to be just a buzzword. And even for the lay people, it's not only for the private or the public institutions, but it's for everyone, so that everybody is more aware of the need. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent, Lina. Muchas gracias. So I hope
Excellent, Lina.
because it's, you know how busy these people are. We have they with us this morning, and we have them through the week. So I hope you have questions for them. We have 15 minutes before coffee break, so that's good news, I know, always. So please, Douglas.
First, thank you very much for giving us this overview of all the initiative and work that you have done in the last month and year. As a regulatory policy guy, this is wonderful. It's like a dream coming true. So you can count with the support, not only the coalition and AdvoMed, but also from the companies that are part of it. Giving the perspective and understanding that Colombia is part of the Andean community, as well as Brazil is part of the Mercosur. How do you see this moving up? I mean, the potential reapplication as a Mercosur level and the Andean community of countries as you leading, because I see that you can lead this effort beyond your countries. So any thought on it?
What can I say that's not going to get me in trouble politically? Because, you know, Mercosur right now is never, yeah, it's not recorded, right? There's no cameras here. No microphones, no, yeah.
Not on the right.
So right now, okay, it's very hard for us, and I don't see it happening. And you know, I'm not gonna make like a beautiful speech here about how wonderful those organizations are and how we want to do that. We want to. It would be great, but first of all, we're gonna have to ensure that it works at federal level, Then we're going to move to the subnational levels, which is states and municipalities. And then maybe only then we're going to be able to approach it within those regional organizations. But I don't see it happening in the short term. I see that it's very hard right now. You know, we have very different approaches to regulation inside Mercosur. As you saw, Brazil is the one before last on regulatory quality, and Argentina is the last one. And Argentina, it's on its way also to apply to OECD membership, but Argentina has a very pro-interventionist choice. Let's say that, and they're not here, right? You know, there's a rivalry. Is that how you say in English? Rivalry between us. Rivalry, yeah, between us and Argentinians. So we make those jokes, you know. But we're very much in different spaces right now. And you know, Uruguay and Paraguay, they're also on their own path. I think they have done some really good things when it comes to doing business environments and so on. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't see that happening in Mercosur level very soon.
I'm a little bit more optimistic than you. No, yo quisiera mencionar que en efecto hay muchos retos.
I would like to say that, yes, there are many challenges, but I believe that spaces like these help us to make some progress to that regards. The exchange that we have between countries is something really important, something as basic as what I was saying, you know, share your calculator with my calculator and compare it and see what we can do with it, you know, and there are other exercises additionally to the integration models, you know, the regional integration models like the Ibero-America network. So this year we're going to be the leaders of that space. It's going to be held in November. And so we welcome all of you if you want to join us and participate. And through those spaces, we could do so. And that's one of the challenges that I was saying, to place this in the public agenda, not only inside the countries, but internationally speaking, and to promote the exchange of experiences and to talk about, okay, how are you doing based on your issues and how I'm doing based on my issues and where I can learn from your experiences, etc.
I see that this is a best practice, it's a great exercise that you can show to the other countries to just follow the same. Because if we achieve that Latin America have the same approach, the same way to establish good regulatory policies aligned with good regulatory practices, we can make the difference in terms of the patients and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe not just a question, but a point to make some comments. In my perception, it's not only in Latin America, because it's happened also in US. There is a big fight now between what the people call the left visions, politicians, and the right politicians. And of course, depending of how you put your boat in what direction, you can see things like regulations or increased regulations or decreased regulations, more fair commerce, more open boundaries and so on. Depends of who are the power, could be different views. So as not, you don't have a crystal ball, I know, but how you can see these different views of opinions between lefts and rights influence, how it can influence the things that you are discussing here, like free commerce, decreased regulatories, fair commerce, and so on.
You know, this has been the number one question during the CEO meeting and summit, and you know, everybody asking, you know, what may change. You know, I think it's very public that Brazil may change its political direction next year, and well, I guess it's very hard to say what's going to happen. I think the one thing that is going to continue on its path is, you know, the agencies are very much mature in Brazil, and they are well protected, institutionalized, and you know, the Congress have been the number one deciding factor on the appointees. We know that, right? So even though sometimes the president that appoints the directors of the agency, in practice is the Congress that make those nominations. So I don't see, regardless of which direction our country goes politically, the agencies, I think they're on the right path. On the rest of the regulatory affair, though, I think that we may have some setbacks, especially on trade, right? And that's a democratic choice. I mean, we're going to have to respect whatever the population votes for on this October in Brazil. And if they decide that they want to vote for a platform that includes a closer, more closed economy. They want more, technical barriers, that has been historically done, and we know that because that's their platform. It's not like something hidden or something dark. It's just, I think that those will be the major setbacks, but we'll have to wait and see, right? Things may change as well in other directions, so let's wait and see.
If I may.
Let me just make one comment. It was my mistake not to ask you to mention your name and position. So Douglas is with Roche. Douglas?
Yeah, okay, sure.
So Roche and José Cajazeira very fast. He's from ABNC.
Okay.
So for the next one, Lina, please.
Okay, thank you. No, muy brevemente, creo que coincido contigo mucho y en el
Just
caso.
very briefly, I agree with you in many of the things you say. And in the case of Colombia, the regulatory policy is more considered like a state policy and not a government policy. The way and they are as important as international commitments and international agreements, in our case, because of all the commitments that we have for the post-access of the OECD, we need to make progress in many of these tools and in many of these aspects of the policy. So regardless of who's in power, if it's a right-wing or a left-wing politician, this transcends it. And that's why it's also important to change that chip we're thinking about, what we were talking about, the benefit that this has.
Hi, John Bloy from Abbott Labs. First, I'd like to thank you both for the presentations. I think they're wonderful. I really want to thank you for the 10% reduction in tariffs. That was really good news. I do agree with you that Brazil is a very complex regulatory environment if you're an international company, right? There's a lot of different agencies and regulations you have to go with. So happy to see the effort to take a look at it and possibly make that better. Lina, I thought I heard you say that you were developing 9.2 standards a day. Is that correct? How do you ensure harmonization and make sure that you're not going down the path of country-specific requirements that the international businesses have to meet?
Ese es uno de los retos más grandes.
That is one of the main challenges that we have. And I didn't mention this, but it's not only for standardization or regulatory topics, it's also involving other areas of public power. And it's something that we're trying to position, the amount of standards that are being issued in Colombia per day is not only come from the executive power, they also come from legislative power, and they increase a lot. So we not only want to rationalize, we want to harmonize all of that and make sure that everything that is done in the different powers of government makes sense, and doesn't go against the interest of the country, because it still happens to us, and we're working on that a lot.
Câmara Brasileira de Diagnóstico Laboratorial. I think the point that Lina made before and of being here, discussing and checking with other countries for benchmarking and seeing the better practices really brings a lot of good experience to internalize. Gianluca, I think you are on the right way. It's great to see what you have been doing here. And I think one of the key strengths that a country can have is like the civil society represented. So no matter who comes, let's say the accomplishments that we have conquered, they are quite important. So there might be setbacks, but let's say that Brazilians shouldn't go too far behind. I mean, we should keep moving and going forward. So that's a very interesting message that I think we all can take away from this several meetings that we are having. And even people from the left side, Cajazeira, for instance, the president of Chile was speaking now at the CEO summit, and he said, I am from the left, but I recognize the power of law. the power of the predictability, the importance of business. We must just see in another way. So I think that's possible. So no matter who comes, we must really work with the accomplishments that we have done so far and try to move forward and count on us for this. That's the main message.
I think I saw Christina. Yeah, before. Okay.
I want to congratulate both actually for the work that your countries have been done. I hope we can replicate that in Ecuador. We have very big issues regarding GRPs. And I want to ask Lina if you can tell us a little more about the observatory. I think how the citizens are participating or who is participating in the observatory, so you can start working in other countries in the same way as to how to promote more GRPs. We have entities that have no idea that this exists. So it will be great if you can share that with us.
Sí, el observatorio por ahora lo tenemos solamente en el departamento.
The observatory is currently only in the National Planning Department. It's something that only us have, and we are the only who manage it. And we're strengthening it because we have this idea of creating all the necessary evidence. Right now, the observatory is hosted in our entity's micro website, and it's based on like visualizing how we visualize the production that we have, based on what we get in the official Gazette. So we get some statistics out of that and we have some data. We are actually doubling our efforts there so that we can have a huge observatory covering everything to it. That's why we have the policing out. That's why we're trying to grade all the evidence and grab all the data that we have there, interpret it, identify the necessary challenges, and generate the recommendations. But if you need anything, we can talk about it. And yes, we can help each other.
Again, I'm another one to congratulate you for all the efforts that you are doing. And I mean, that is kind of like music to our ears. And please count on us to support all those efforts. But beyond that, I think, of course, we are all aware of many challenges. And as you were saying, Gianluca, the regional commitments sometimes kind of like work against what the local efforts are done in regards of proper implementation and follow on good regulatory practices. And we experience it like on a daily basis with like Mercosur, and some requirements that were already passed on from Brazil because it was clearly demonstrated that they were not adding value. Now they're coming back. And it's kind of like, I mean, we're supposed to be moving in the direction to simplify and to understand and to provide solid basis for requirements that are internationally aligned and that really add value. But this is not the case. So that is something that we discuss among ourselves. I mean, is there any way that we can do something in order to prevent that to happen? Because at the end of the day, what is gonna, the end result is gonna be that, okay, Brazil is gonna reincorporate some requirements and we're gonna open a specific trade concern. And nobody's going to be benefiting out of that, except we're wasting resources on redoing something instead of building and making, I mean, more advances in the right direction. So I know it is complex, but I don't know if there's anything you think that we can do, or that's the only way we can do. We can go.
It has happened several times that we have received the private sector with some demands regarding, the agencies doing a terrific job, but there's this Mercosur role that is either non-updated or is going in another direction, especially on the food sector. I mean, this happens a lot, and it's so complicated. I think that one of the issues here, first of all, I don't think there is any easier answer here. I think that for Mercosur, I think it's more of a philosophical question, right? What the bloc wants to be and what does it want to become? In the 90s, it wanted to be a free trade agreement, and it did not take off. I mean, we know that, and that's we're very sad about it. And he hasn't seen its revival, right? And every time we talk about Mercosur right now is to make exemptions from its long-standing rules. So it's either for us to take 2 times the 10% reduction in tariffs based on an exemption for emergencies, because the other members didn't want to discuss the common tariff agreement. So it has overall became an obstacle in some issues, but it has also become, a place for very limited trade, but important trade. I don't think we can live without it as of right now. But I mean, for me, and that's something that I would like to see in a second administration of this government. And if I were to stay, I'm not, because I have like personal, I have a personal steps in my life. But if I were just going to stay in my department for a second term, next 4 years, it would be to do something at Mercosul level, because I think now this is the next thing that we have to do when it comes to regulatory practices. I was talking, we're doing everything that we can to make it easier to open a business in Brazil, and I was mentioning with my colleague that specifically handles that, and I saying, what's the next step is to have a treaty on it in Mercosul. So when you open a company in Brazil, it's open for all Mercosul, and the same thing for some regulations and so on. So I think that's the next step for Mercosul, and I would like to see that happening. And that was a plan for my department for an eventual second term, if that ever comes to happen, right?
Please leave a legacy for that.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the most important things, right? Is that we're not doing something that as soon as we leave is gonna fade out. So that's all of our projects have that concern, and that's something what Lina said, that she sees it more as a politics of state than a particular government. And I think this is what's really important here.
Thank you. And I have also a comment for Lina. I think this is really great what you're doing there. All the tools that you have developed, I mean, as a project, we are really enjoying having visibility and using them very actively. And really, Susan is helping us a lot, that in doing that on a daily basis with every single thing that we're doing with Colombia. So this is really great. Congratulations, and really thank you very much for the support. But there's an element that is kind of like very, very basic, and it's like on the definition of what a technical regulation is and what it is not, and the debate that comes along with that. Is there anything that you're planning to do kind of like in order to develop, I don't know if it's a toolkit or what, is there anything that you think that you can do to facilitate and to prevent those discussions to happen?
We were talking about that yesterday with Susan, actually. Sí, es un debate muy importante.
Yes, it is a very important debate, especially because right now, with our responsibility to review the quality of the regulatory impact assessment and the technical regulations, we have that task. There are general international guidelines that allow us to define what would be the technical regulation and what it wouldn't be, but within the country, we don't have that. We were talking about this with Susan, yesterday, that the Ministry of Trade assumed the responsibility at some moment to say, this is a regulation, this is not. But that was just with some sectors. And with the health sector, there are some things that they still say that it's not and that should go through us. We want to continue working on that. Regarding the guidelines, as I said, we are very hopeful that we're going to be able to define clear guidelines, especially because of the gaps that we have in the concepts and the technical aspects in some topics also. But as I was saying, and now talking about a challenge that I know we're going to have in the future, if we have the guidelines, but if Colombia doesn't have that in a standard, it's very difficult for it to be adopted. So it's going to be a huge challenge. And I think that in the future, we need to think about what standard we need to modify, what standard we need to ask for, so that we can have clear conceptual aspects, or at least somebody that's going to tell us very clearly who's going to manage that discussion. But it's one of the challenges that we're facing today, regarding technical regulations, and we're working on it.
Thank you, Stephen Weiss from AdvaMed and the MDRC project lead. I also echo my colleagues' thanks for the illuminating and very enlightening presentations, and I make a prediction that this session will be one of the more watched ones in the course of the project, both internally and externally. Maybe I could share two anecdotes that might facilitate talking about GRP, maybe getting back to George's question. One is that we really much consider GRP a type of quality management system for the development, publishing, and maintenance of technical regulations. quality management systems are required for companies. You think of ISO 9000, it's required for medical device facilities, I think ISO 1345. And it would be unthinkable to imagine a medical device production line, for example. You have a multi-stages of production and you're going to just ship the product to the patient or hospital without having any tests, any quality management system. But then you ask about technical regulations. What's the quality management system for the development and the maintenance of the technical regulations? And for the countries, unlike Colombia and Brazil, you get these kind of blank stares. Well, no, that's not for us. How can you know? How can you know that the regulation is net positive? So then we've seen that begin to kind of get the wheels thinking on moving in that direction. We're not suggesting there needs to be an ISO 9000 certification for it, but that GRP serves that role. The other one in response to George's question is GRP is not about more regulation or less regulation. It's about better regulation, more effective regulation, improving the regulatory stock efficacy. And unfortunately, you've got, because there's been a long period in many countries, including the US, of insufficient attention and maintenance to the existing stock, you get a growing pessimism about any new proposed regulations. And that's with some validity. I mean, there's so many rules on the books that are disproportionately onerous on small and medium-sized enterprises that, so I'd say in response to your question, it's not about left, it's not about right, it's about really doing a much better job at reviewing the existing stock and taking much better care in how you prepare new technical regulations so that you can both create new regulations that aren't overly restrictive on trade and they actually achieve it. And so we very much view GRP as nothing aligned either politically left or right, and it should appeal to those on either side of the political spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. We have now 9 minutes for a coffee break, so please be back at 10:30. We are in the US, so I'm very mindful of that. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So we are going to restart. The way we reorganize this panel so everyone fits in the table is that we're going to have Jessica and group and José Cajazeira now and Jorge Cajazeira, and they will make their presentations. We'll have time for questions, and then we'll bring in Colombia and Mexico for their presentations, okay? So, okay, as everyone comes back to the room, I would like to invite Jessica Roop, Senior Manager, International Development, American National Standards Institute in the United States. Please, Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Let's see. There we go. And thank you for advancing that. Hopefully I'll be able to do it on my own. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the American National Standards Institute and our role in the US standardization system. Stephen invited me to give this presentation and only gave me 15 minutes to cover the entire standardization system and what we do in the United States. So it is a feat for sure. So I'm just going to cover a few of these items because we are sharing a larger deck with you as a result of today's discussion. And you can review that as you wish, and certainly utilize myself and Stephen and any of our MDRC contacts if you have any questions. So this slide should not look unfamiliar to you. These are the core principles of the World Trade Organization's technical barriers to trade. And we're specifically looking at the Annex 3 of that code of good practice for the preparation, the adoption, and application of standards. These are the key provisions. And we have been talking about this for the last 2 days about standards should not act as a technical barrier to trade. There should be preferential treatment for the use and application of international standards. There should not be duplication of efforts or overlap, and there's a strive or a need to fulfill consensus, and allowing enough time for comment for those that review and responding to comments if you receive them in due time, and taking all comments into account, so balance and openness to provide for that consensus process. And I want to cover this fairly quickly, but there are more slides on this, but the American National Standards Institute is unique in what we do. We are a private, non-for-profit organization. We are not government. We don't produce standards. We are a membership-based organization that provide the neutral forum and the platform for both the public and private sector. And ANSI has accepted the Code of Good Practice on behalf of our accredited standards developing organizations, of which we have currently approximately 240, a little less. I think it's 239 based off of our most recent annual report. And this Code of Good Practice we call it the ANSI Essential Requirements, and they very much mirror the elements that are produced in the Code of Good Practice. The elements of coherence and use of international standards, lack of no duplication, and balance and consensus. These elements are similar to those of this ANSI Essential Requirements document that is updated every year and is available to the public for review. I could spend the rest of the afternoon, particularly just on this slide, but these are the substantive provisions that are based within the code. And we've talked about all of these elements. So the clause is provided for you, as well as, again, all of the elements in the summary of each of the clauses. But I want to continue through the course of the presentation and bring to your attention elements of the overall US standardization system and what makes us unique. We are a bottom-up approach in the United States. The market drives the implementation and development of standards. It is not the government that drives that, and the government can be part of that process in the US standardization system. It allows for flexibility and openness, and it allows for a voice for the public and private sector to participate. And again, these principles should look fairly repetitive to you, I think, at this point. But I think the importance is bringing to your attention that we in the US utilize these guiding principles and really want to ensure that these standards that we develop in the United States meet societal needs and the market needs, the technology needs, and they should not be developed as technical barriers to trade. A way in which we enforce that is a document that we produce called the US Standardization Strategy, or we call it the USSS. And there's a link here for you that helps, you can refer to going forward, but really talks about what the system is really designed to do and how we adhere to the Code of Good Practice and those elements. And they very much, again, mirror those WTO TBT principles. Again, talking about the market-driven system within the United States and the flexibility, and it's sector-led, not government-led. Oh, I think I just lost my slides here. Here we go. There's one more. And allowing the stakeholders to find solutions and identify solutions that best fit their need. And it's not the government that's telling them to do it. It's not ANSI that's telling them to do it. I want to focus on this slide as well to talk a little bit about the US public-private partnership. So ANSI again provides that neutral forum for both the public and private sectors to participate, again, when there are new areas of technology, to provide a collaborative space when there is a need. But there's also the need for how does the government, people have asked me, how does the US government participate in the standardization process? So no single government agency has control of the development and of the standards in the United States. Really, each agency determines which standards meets its needs. And it is enforced through a law that was enacted it's called the law of 1995. It was enacted in 1996 by Bill Clinton, our former president, and encourages each of the government agencies to utilize voluntary consensus standards in lieu of creating government unique standards. And why would it do that? Creating a government unique standard is a timely process, and it's also a very expensive process, especially when there is already a process in place through the private sector. And so with this law that was developed, it identifies the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which is part of the US Department of Commerce, as the entity that helps to facilitate that process for all of the government agencies. And they are identified to provide a report of how the governments are utilizing private sector standards and which standards they are participating in. And this is very important in the US standardization system, and simply wanted to emphasize that fact, not law. The last element I really wanted to focus on is a document that was produced by the International Policy Committee of ANSI, which is now the International Policy Advisory Group, or the IPAG. Again, we offer that neutral forum for both the public and private sector to participate in the ANSI process. And when it's in that process, we have these committees. And in June of 2019, we created a document that you see here, and I realize it's very small, but in the final slide, you will see a link to this actual document that you can review more closely, and certainly we can answer any questions. But the reason I'm bringing it to your attention this morning is that this is a framework that we developed through this policy committee through ANSI, where both the public and private sector participated, and developed this list of a guide, if you will, of the essential elements to help enforce and illustrate how we can implement the GRP, the good regulatory practices. It's very much based on the Asia-Pacific economic frameworks, as well as elements within the USMCA text. And I wanted to provide this as a guide for you and a framework for you going forward. If your country doesn't currently have something in place, this can be utilized within your country as a starting point or a framework or a guide for you. And again, this is offered publicly. It's that final tick point on the bottom of the screen where you can access that. And that information is something that Stephen and I worked very closely with our policy committee to develop. And I implore you to utilize it as a tool. And there's other information here specifically regarding the ANSI, American National Standards, the ANS process of how we accredit our standards developing organizations. And again, that likely would be a whole nother set of slides and presentations, but there is more information within the deck of slides that I provided to our group here today. And I welcome the opportunity to speak with you all. I've had to say, I've had the opportunity to meet some really wonderful individuals throughout this week, the last several days. And I hope that we continue this momentum going forward and continue these conversations once we leave the conference room today, because I know this is our final day. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm willing to take any questions or add additional points of clarity. And I hope I adhered to your time schedule.
Thank you very much, Jessica, not only for the presentation today, but for your partnership. It's really good to work with you. So thank you so much. I would like to pass the floor now to Jorge Manuel Reis Cajazeira, Head of International Standardization, Brazil Association of Technical Standards, ABNT.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank you on behalf of ABNT for your invitation. It's wonderful event. Congratulations, perfect. Wonderful people, so good friends. There's even an American guy here that supports Botafogo, a second division team in Brazil. But first, allow me to make a disclosure. I am engineer, not lawyer. So bearing that I initially want to apologize with my diction. I was born stuttered. And of course, with time and a lot of speech therapists, I improved, but I got old, so I'm Paul Harry now. So imagine a Brazilian stuttering and deaf speaking English. Bear that in mind. That said, I ask you to use your translation system, so I can honor the Brazilians and Latin Americans brothers here speaking in the official language in South America, that is the Portuñol. That's a mix of Portuguese and it's not only in Latin America, in Miami also. Aí eu, ok. Muito bem, vamos lá.
All right. So, the world sees Brazil in a very interesting way. The world sees Brazil basically because of soccer, and then they remember Pelé or Neymar. They think about coffee and they think about samba when they think of us. I often joke with my grandson because he's learning how to read and write, and I tell him, this is a 6 or this is a 9. So he learns that we can see the same thing over different perspectives. But just as a reminder, Brazil hasn't won a World Cup for over 20 years. Samba is not the most heard type of song in Brazil, and we no longer are great exporters of coffee. So the image that the world has of Brazil is not correspondent to reality. We want to be known as the country that feeds 1 billion people because of our agribusiness, because of the production of soybean, corn, barley, rice, in a respectful way to the environment. Because the idea that Brazil destroys the environment, if we look at our forest area, Brazil is a global leader with 56% of its territory covered with forests. So this is a little bit of the mission of standardization in Brazil, is to change this perspective to a perspective that is more coherent to our reality. I used to have a boss that often told me that whenever you're doing a presentation, you have to start at the end, so you make the best use of your time. So this is the slide that I will use to conclude my presentation, and I'll give you more details about it. But basically, this relationship between policy, legislation, and standards needs to be an integrated relationship. And that's where InMetro has an essential role. We have an institutional memory from InMetro called Marquinhos. And on the other side, we have ABNT. It's important that we are the single forum for standardization in Brazil. On the other hand, if the legislation, policies, offer the standards opportunity of a legal understanding, on the other side, the standards bring to the public sphere the state of the art. Let's make clear that standards are volunteer and regulations are mandatory. So we are talking about a voluntary aspect here. So that's why you should not create barriers to trade. So ABNT was founded in the 1940s. It's a private organization, just like ANSI. It represents Brazil on ISO, IEC, on COPANT, on AMN. And it's a standardization and also a certification agency. And we are signatories of the codes of practices from international organizations like the UN and others.
Okay, so I've already talked about this slide, so I'm going to go to the next one. Okay, so in terms of our norms, we have 270 technical committees, 8,800 42 standards, almost 9,000. And it's interesting to highlight that 31% are international ones. That is to say that our archive has a strong, close connection with the international standards, especially IEC and ISO ones, and that facilitates things for us. It makes our dialogue with regulations and everything easier. This is a little bit of our strategy that has been spearheaded by our president, Mario. Mario has a very interesting vision that Brazil has to be representative in terms of standardization because of its importance in trade. It was not like that before, and that has been changing. So we have 4 interesting areas of interest. ESG, I'm a president of that area at ISO. Regulations that are fair and harmonized. And of course, the slogan, one standard, one test, accepted everywhere, is something very important for us. Regarding the Brazilian interests, we really seek to participate and work on deforestation, for example, agribusiness, free trade, well-being, all of that deserves the efforts of ABNT through its committees. This morning, we were up very early to discuss green nitrogen and the Brazilian proposal of creating that. Our current challenge, and the challenge for other speakers as well, is that the strategy of our government is to have fewer acts or laws and more standards. So that facilitates world trade. So this is a challenge that is part of an act that was already mentioned by a speaker about economic freedom. So we have a very special role to transform the industry's requirements into standards so that we can contribute to reducing the number of laws and acts so that standards are more broadly used and, of course, reflect what the society needs. Since we are talking about medical devices, we have to remember that Brazil has 726 standards and 58% are international standards. So internationalization, it's already a part of the standards in the medical device sector. 44% are from ISO, but 42 are national standards. So this internationalization is facilitated by Brazil recognizing international standards. So how does the relationship between regulatory models and standards work? Do I hear an echo? No? Okay. The regulatory model in Brazil, whenever in Brazil we have a demand, we have a risk analysis conducted and we discuss that technically. And if the risk of a standard, if the risk to society is considered medium or low, then ABNT prepares the technical standard. If there's a high risk, then a technical regulation is issued. An example is the electric outlets in Brazil with the 3rd pin as a safety demand. Since it was considered a high risk, then a technical regulation was issued. Our regulatory model during the COVID-19 pandemic went through a lot of discussion, but we have to remember that Brazil is one of the countries that has vaccinated more people in the world. We're close to 80% of our population vaccinated, which is a very significant number considering that we have Amazonia and also the dimension of our country. So Anvisa, the National Surveillance Health Agency, and ABNT were very important regarding the standards to fight COVID-19. All the standards issued regarding masks and everything were issued in a record time through ABNT to support national domestic initiatives. I could spend the whole afternoon talking about the benefits of standardization, but I would like to highlight a few points. The rules are voluntary, but regulations are not. We do not create barriers to trade. We want to facilitate trade. With that said, I would like to remember that within ISO, and that's what our president is asking, we have to accelerate the process of standards. The ISO process it takes about 3 or 4 years. So in Brazil, we have conducted a very important work about norms that could be issued within a year, depending on the urgency. So, for example, regarding forest fires, we've had severe fires due to drought. And so a standard to fight fires was very important. And we were able to do that together with society, with all the actors involved. We created a norm in record time. This was presented to ISO, and ISO will create a working group to discuss that. So that is another way of working, showing the importance of standardization when we're fighting issues or challenges like the pandemic or social and environmental problems. And this correlation with regulators, like in Metro, is paramount in ABNT's strategy. To conclude my presentation, the regulatory convergence is not a difficult issue, especially because 60% of what we work with are already international standards. The main entities like ISO and INC have a memorandum of understanding with us, so that facilitates our interactions very much. And again, I would like to highlight that ABNT is a national forum for standardization, and it has to remain a single institution, because the norms are part of the day-to-day of the Brazilian population, and that's very important for us. So thank you very much. And I would like to repeat the slogan, one standard, one test, accepted everywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Obrigada pela apresentação, excelente também.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
I'll call Colombia and Mexico to join us. Do we have questions for Jessica and Jorge? I think we're gonna, we changed the format, so because we didn't fit everyone here at the table, so that's why I'm opening for questions now before we turn to the other countries. Anyone? They may, yeah, right.
Or email me.
Okay.
We're all friends now.
We are friends. I feel like we are. Great. So thank you very much. I would like to call Monica Vivas, Standardization Director from Incotec, together with Daniel Trillos, Subdirector de Normalización. And also I would like to call to the table Raul Romero Anaya, Quality Infrastructure Coordinator from the General Directorate of Standards, Mexico. Thank you for joining us. I would like to pass the floor first to Monica and Danielle for your presentation.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you. It's very important to have the opportunity to share information and the best practice about our activities and all the important results of this coalition. Nuestra presentación, ¿quién la tiene? Oh.
We're going into our presentation. If you can just, thank you. So we're going to talk about the experience that we have as ICONTEC, which is the National Organization for Standardization, and about this standardization activity and how we carry this out as a voluntary aspect and how that contributes to the regulatory measures, which are really important. Now, who are we? Well, I think that's the most important thing that we should mention. We were born in 1963 as an initiative of all Colombian entrepreneurs who at that moment were seeing that they were being part of an international context, it's very important. And in order to do so, they had to be competitive. And for that, they require standards. So that's why we were created, as a need of the private sector to make sure the country could be competitive enough, internationally speaking. And from that point of view, we developed a government function that was delegated into a private organization like which is ICONTEC, just as Ainsi mentioned, and that's why we were assigned to do so. And so our government, as we can see here, is participating with the private sector and the public sector. So we have the representation. We have the representation of 5 government members, each one with its own substitute, representing the most important sectors so as to provide better competitiveness and productivity in the country. We see here the members are there, and we also have the participation of the private sector. What we're trying to ensure here is that we have a balance between private and public sector so as to answer to the needs that we have and always having a technical contribution. And for that, what we do is we work on standardization. And with that, we support with defining all those decisions, all of the rules that apply, the best practices that need to be applied, and all of that. And we not only do that, we have to ensure that all the standards that we developed can be applied. And so we also provide other services where we teach the content of the standards via training programs, and we promote the implementation of these standards through activities that have to do with conformity assessments. In addition to disclosing these standards, we are promoting their compliance through certification processes, through validation and verification processes, through test trials in metrology laboratories. And we have an additional area which is also very important, and through which we also work on cooperation activities and we work on special projects. Now, specifically talking about our role, and that has to do with regulatory best practices and measures, well, we developed this role as an advisor for the national government, with which we accompany all the regulators when they are developing their technical regulations and in all the laws that have to do with the application of the technical regulations. In Colombia, there is a commission, which is the Intersectorial Quality Commission, that the Ministry of Commerce and Tourism will basically present that because they are in charge of this. And we participate in that because here we have the convergence of knowing what are the technical regulations that are required, what are the technical regulations that are being developed, and we participate permanently in all of these. As an advisor for the government, seeing what ABNT was just presenting, we saw that there was a need to develop a technical standard or a technical regulation because the regulators have their own needs. And so what we did was we supported those regulators first so that through the technical standard that we adopt, we can support the development of the technical regulation. That is why we are an entity that is accompanying and advising the government in the development of the technical documents. And also, we have to make sure that these standards are not technical obstacles to trade, barriers to trade. They need to promote trade. And so we're also the government support to foresee the commitments the country has regarding trade agreements. With all the free trade agreements that we've signed. And of course, we've always want to make sure that the standards do not become a technical barrier to trade. Some of our figures, we have some 6,800 current standards. Of those, 52% of all the ones that we've developed have to do with international standards or documents trying to make trade easier and also trying to support all the different sectors so that we can have a level of competitiveness that is similar to what other countries have in this level. And here we have all the sectors we're working at. We work through 276 technical committees that work in the different sectors. To date, we are working on 421 projects, standard projects, and we have a little bit more than 441 additional topics that need to be included as part of our standardization program. I'm not going to go into detail into this one, talking about what the standardization activity is. That's the flow that we follow, what we have on screen. What I would like to show is this first element of the process, which is the relationship with society. We believe this is the most important one because the whole standardization process or program has to start from understanding and knowing what are the needs of society, of the citizens per se, what needs to be regulated at that moment or what is required as new technologies. And so from there, we develop our standardization program. And then we have all the necessary stages of a standardization program. We need to assess if it's feasible or not. We prepare a draft of the document, which we present, and then we have the study of the document with all the different stakeholders so that we can make sure and guarantee that everybody who has to do with this document knows about the document and can provide their own information. This is what we know as public consultation. Then we have all the approval phases for that document, and I think it's not worth taking time describing these. Now, referring back to this first phase in that relationship with society, well, following the guideline that we need to develop our document based on international documents, well, we've also adopted the ISO methodology to define our standardization strategy. Through this methodology, we're trying to assure that the priorities of the standardization program responds to the priorities the country has in the terms of, I don't know, if the sector has a high level of incidence in the GDP, or if there's a high possibility of exporting things, or if we are also importing things. And then we validate this with all the all the stakeholders, and then we start our program. Now, based on the new context we're living in, we have this digitally also, and it has public access. They can enter to this tool that's called eConecta, and this is our digital website. And through these, they can learn about the topics that we're going to be working on, or they can actually request us to work on something. And through this tool, they can also score the priorities that we have of the different topics so that we are ensuring that we're covering the topics that are of most interest for society as a whole. As I was saying before, you can see that we're working in all the different sectors of the economy. And right now, we need to highlight that some sectors like agri, mining, or construction, or sustainability, or digital transformation, all of these sectors have huge changes because of the context we are in today. And as a standardization organization, we need to respond to the needs that they have so that they can really cover their challenges and solve the challenges that they face. And measuring what, or something about what Jorge mentioned regarding COVID, well, we had the same situation during the pandemic. We had a huge demand to adopt standards very quickly so that they can respond to the pandemic control. We had to do this with an emergency mechanism, but what we're always trying to ensure is that the standardization process will respond to the need society has. This is an additional tool. We're also going to give you the link for this. This is the tool I was showing you. And in there, we have the whole standardization program we're working on. And any of the interested parties or any entrepreneur or any regulatory entity in our country can go in and learn about all the different projects we're working on and could provide their knowledge or expertise to these. That's in the lamest terms what we do as a standardization organization. We're always trying to make sure that we are giving something back to society, that we can integrate everything together with the government and the other regulatory bodies so that we can cover all the needs that they have, not only regarding technical regulations, which is obviously a priority, but also considering how to improve the competitiveness of a specific productive sector, because that is part of our state strategy. And so if that happens, we support that through the standardization processes. In this second part, we're going to talk about why are we adopting international standards and what are the benefits of having these standards and the challenges we're also facing with international standards. Thank you very much, Monica. Good morning, everybody. To continue talking about what Monica was mentioning with this tool is that this tool is not only developed so that the companies and the interest stakeholders in the country know what we're doing, but any organization anywhere in the world can go into it, and learn about the documents and what we're working on, and also provide their opinion. Now, regarding international standards adoption, well, we come from Decree 1595, that was adopted that talks about the adoption of international documents and considering all of that to eliminate technical barriers to trade that are unnecessary. We are members of ISO and IEC. We are the ones who represent Colombia in ISO, and we're also part of the International Committee of the IEC, and we're also part or have agreements of other standardization organizations. Some of them develop these standards, others are entities, and others develop standards for other countries or our international standardization bodies. So what are the benefits of adopting international standards? Well, first of all, we have making trade easier. This is a mechanism that could help us eliminate the barriers to trade. It helps us also to improve competitiveness and have economic efficiency. That's an important topic that we've seen, that we have to improve competitiveness in those sectors that are adopting more of these. It also facilitates access to the markets in the country and access to other markets in those regional and international markets. This helps us and also helps us for the regulators, because instead of the regulators having to go in and doing all the technical analysis and pay the consultancy to do that, they can have the requirements when they're based on an international standard. It's easier to do that based on the regulation they're going to develop. And it's also going to help us to comply with the good regulatory practices, especially It's going to help them comply with the different obligations that they have and the commitments they have based on the agreement for technical obstacles to trade. Something very technical is barrier to trade. Something interesting here is that having that information and doing that technological transfer to the country of good practices or new technology, it can come from this. Because of an international standard, we can bring that technology into the country, and that could help the different sectors so that they can continue evolving by using things that have been used worldwide and that have been already tested and that can be introduced. And lastly, we're also optimizing cost and timelines for standardization instead of starting from scratch and having to do all the research, the studies, and the analysis. When we bring an international standard into the country, we facilitate this a lot more. And so what we're basically doing is to see if the context of the international standard applies to the national standard or the national context, and then there would be no issues. We've also found some things that could be considered as the cons for this, when adopting international standards. One of the main things we've seen is that it's not easy for the national industry, for the domestic industry, and for the internal stakeholders to participate in the adoption of international standards. This means that sometimes the internal positions are not reflected in an international document, and when they are going to be adopted, those conditions are not included. And so we need to do modifications or adjustments in the document, and that could lead to some barriers also to trade, some conditions of the international standard that cannot be complied with in the context of the country. Something else that could happen is that imbalance in the technology development of the country when we have an international standard. Sometimes we adopt the international standard in the national context, and the test trials cannot be done in the country. The technology that the international standard is asking for is not implemented in the country, and that could create some sort of imbalances in the technological development of the country when we are faced with that international document. One or two new barriers that are now being presented when adopting international standards is that on one side, the cost, because of the copyrights of some of the organizations when we're going to adopt their standards, that's something that we've been faced with, and that's a difficulty. We want to adopt that document. Something that's happened a lot here when we're here in the United States is that has happened with the organizations in the United States. When they develop the standards, they are international standards or internationally recognized standards or used standards that we want to adopt nationally. And then the organization, the standardization is asking for royalties for copyrights to adopt those standards, which is quite understandable. But in some cases, these are higher than the value that could be received by the adopting of the standard. So that's why we cannot adopt them, because what we're going to pay is never going to be recovered when selling those standards, and we cannot adopt it. That happens in some cases. In other cases, the topic is a lot more complex, and there are some standardization bodies that are not allowing us to adopt these as national standards. So when we're going to sign an agreement with them, they tell us we are not letting you to use this standard for a national adoption. If you want to use the standard, you have to use our standard as is. So what has happened there, that some of the interested parties in the country have developed their own standards, so they never adopt this international standard, and then we create technical barriers to trade. That's one of the barriers that we found recently, and it's something that's really concerning to all of us because we haven't been able to adopt those international standards that way. And something else that we faced, and that's really related to the first part, is when we cannot participate in these international standards, there are some anthropomorphic and climate conditions or geographical conditions that whenever we're going to adopt the document, we cannot adopt this. And so we need to modify it.
Okay. Vale, listo.
Frente a las iniciativas que tenemos para fomentar esa
Considering the initiatives we have to promote that participation and the disclosure of all the standards in the country, well, we have the tool that I was mentioning, that Monica was mentioning, where the different parties can get all the necessary to support for the standardization process, and where they can give us their interest or their initiatives, as Jessica was also mentioning.
un enfoque que desde el mercado se busque
So the approach we have is that from the market, we need to make sure that we have this standards. I mean, that they're not imposed, that they come from the market so that we know what is needed and so that we can also communicate with them very well to be able to develop them. But we're also working very strongly with public bodies and with the regulators per se, so as to identify what are the regulations that they are working on and what they want to focus on so that we can do the adoption of international standards as necessary. We had some cases of bodies that wanted to do this regulation. We brought the international standard, they already adopted, and so it's easier for them to establish the standardization regulations based on that. We have our plan available to all the interested stakeholders, and they can give us their points of view, qualify them, modify even the priorities that we have. And we also have tools, digital tools. We have a virtual consultation room. This was done during the pandemic because the people could not go to our rooms directly to do the consultation. So we created this virtual room so that anybody from any country could enter it, could access it, especially our domestic partners. You know, they can go in, it's free, and they can learn about the different content that we have there. We also have another platform called e-collection, where any organization can have access, paying a certain amount on certain recollection of data, and they could have access to the standards that we have. And we also have our standards in an ebook digital form, and we have it in the e-commerce platform. They can go into that platform, they can download the standard and have it with them whenever they want to. Now, we have some marketing campaigns in social media. We've seen that through social media, we can get to many of the stakeholders and many of the different parties that could be interested. And the standards are seen and are presented in forums and presentations and events. Everything we can do, we are doing. And we're also developing different types of materials that talk about these standards, like videos or brochures, to make sure that people understand what they have. You know, maybe the technical standard per se is very difficult and complicated. So here what we have is like a summary of that so that they can learn what it is about. And then if they want to get more information, they can get the standard. And we're also working joint projects with other organizations, thinking that standardization is not a standard per se, but it's creating a solution for the different interested parties. So based on that, we have different projects where we're not only thinking about, okay, we'll write we'll draft the standard and that's it. No, we're helping with the implementation, with the training and other things so that it's not only the drafting of the standard. And now thinking about the future, as I was saying, what we're doing right now is what are we thinking that we're going to do in the future? Well, we want to explore new technology tools to develop the standards so that these standards can be worked on online and not only wait until the committee meets so that they can be worked on with shared documents and so that all the stakeholders can go in and give it the necessary documents so that that document is creating this shared knowledge also and would cover the requirements that we're looking for. So we are trying also to get into new platforms with e-libraries and to sell this in different digital platforms so that they're easier to get to know and worked on. And we want to strengthen also that standardization as sellers of standards, you know, as having this standardization services that will help them with solutions and that can respond to the different needs of the interested parties. And also we're working on having agreements with other organizations to improve, facilitate, and work on the consultation of the standards and how to use them. So I'm wrapping this up with this. There's another topic that we're working on. There's an initiative from ISO and IEC about developing smart standards. We've also been working on that, and part of what we want is to have our standards not only in a digital form or in a PDF form. We want to have them in an XML file format so that it's easier to be used, so that we can have better deliverables, other products, and so that they can use these standards in a better way. And so that these standards that right now are only readable and understandable by humans, what we're trying to make sure is that these could also be read by machines in the next phase and understood by these machines in the future. So that's a path that we're following, you know, it's quite aligned with what ISO and IEC is working on, as well as many of the standardization bodies in developed countries.
Thank you very much, Monica and Danielle, for this very comprehensive presentation. Very good. Thank you very much. I'd like to. No, first we have Raul. There is an order here, José Mas. Yeah. Is it really urgent? We can open exception. No. Okay. So I'd like to pass the floor to Raul Romero from Mexico for his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Renata. Thank you to Sandra for all the support that's been giving. Thank you to the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence. I will switch to Spanish. My whole presentation is in English, but I will feel more comfortable and more fluid speaking Spanish. Para mí es un verdadero placer y honor.
So for me, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you in person after 2 or a little bit more than 2 or 3 years, you know, of just observing a screen and looking at people and observing the people through computer screens and TVs and all that. But luckily, this allows us to get closer to each other as authorities, the different sectors and the private organizations and even society to strengthen all the work that we've done regarding good regulatory practices. So first of all, I bring our warmest hellos from my superiors, who is the Director of Standards of the Ministry of the Economy, the head of the Standardization Competitiveness area, and also of the Ministry of the Economy. The General Standardization Directorate is the administrative Mexican area that has federal competency, or at least in the whole country, you know, has the federal power to issue official Mexican standards, you know, that are normally known as the technical regulations, which can be applied throughout the country. And so,
so I would like to give you some general context, a very important one, a very extensive one, of the system in our country for quality infrastructure and for how we create technical regulations and how we assess them. Just to give you some background information about the changes in our regulation processes, they're still ongoing. This change has not finished. I hope my presentation won't take more than 15 minutes. I brought 26 slides, but I'll try to be very brief in my explanation of these changes. To give you some background info, there are 3 important stages in the history of our quality infrastructure legislation. It started in 1905 and 1928. There was a law that was called the Law of Weights and Measures. But back then, we did not regulate standardization. However, it did create a national measurement unit system. By the year 1941 and until the 1960s, we had a law for industrial standards, which later was transformed into the general law of standards, weights, and measures. The Ministry of Industry and Commerce back then created the standardization system for the first time in Mexico. And then during the 1980s and 90s, and into the year 2000, we had the federal law on metrology and standardization, which is the law that existed before the current one. And due to the context, because that's when Mexico started joining international free trade agreements, this is where we went into a transition from a closed economy into a liberalization, a more open type of economy. And this is where the system that we now know was created. Next one, please. But now there's a new standard for quality infrastructure. It was enacted in 2020, and this was a true watershed. And when I listened to Colombia, if I'm not mistaken, it struck me when they spoke about how they didn't have a specific legal framework for standardization or for quality infrastructure. This quality infrastructure law is based on the international standards. That's where the pillars are. But this law wants to go beyond that. It wants to cover everything that has to do with standardization, conformity assessment, metrology, market surveillance. And also, it wants to create the foundations for an industrial policy in the country. It wants all of the productive and economic sectors, including the academia, researchers, and everyone. It wants to engage everyone in standardization activities. So there is a concept that is called legitimate objectives of public interest, and later I'll explain what this means, because this is what the law promotes. It promotes trade exchange, the creation of greater digital and physical infrastructure so as to promote conformity assessment activities. It also enables the collaboration of different members or all of the actors of the national quality infrastructure system. And for the first time ever, the concept of market surveillance is introduced, something that is lawful now. And for Mexico, this is something new, but at an international level, it isn't. This is a good regulatory practice that's been around for some time. And so we analyze different systems, the European system, the US system, and that's why we decided to include this concept of market surveillance as a good regulatory practice for the first time here. It's included in our legal framework now. So on this slide, I explained the objective of the law, which is to create the foundations of industrial policies. Here are the pillars: standardization, accreditation, conformity assessment, metrology, and market surveillance, as I've mentioned. The idea is to promote economic development and also to increase the quality of goods and services and to expand the productive capacity of the country to improve value chains. And the main objective is to promote international trade and to guard safeguard the public interest in the meantime. There's a breakdown of these objectives that will be coming on another slide. This one's in Spanish, but it's just to give you an idea of the frameworks upon which the new legislation is supported. Here you can see on the legal framework the different laws that I mentioned and their historical evolution. The law of 1905, the 1945, the 1961, and the current one in 2020, the quality infrastructure law. They included different principles and policies that shaped our national system. There's a federal law, which is called the planning law. So when I listened to Lina from the planning department in Colombia, it made perfect sense to me because our systems are very similar in this way. At the federal national level, there is a national development plan, and this plan is issued every 6 years. Every time there's a change in administration, every time we have a new president. And at the level of the ministries or secretariats, we have sectorial programs. For instance, there is the economic development plan, but there's another program, the National Quality Infrastructure Development Plan. When I listen to other countries, this would be the equivalent of a regulatory schedule or agenda. And for us, this is where we gather everything around the subjects that need to become a technological regulation, technological regulation. And this program is refreshed every year. But then I should also mention international free trade agreements like the USMCA, TPAT, TLC-QUEM, which is the equivalent of with the European Union, just to give you some examples. We also have the agreement against technical obstacles to trade of the World Trade Organization, one that is very relevant for us for our technical bylaws and regulations. And then there's another agreement for phytosanitary regulations and some other international regulations. And we also follow the work of what previous colleagues have explained and from their organization. So this general framework, which is both legal and in terms of tools and international agreements and programs, this is our crucible from which we take the good regulatory practices for the development of the Mexican national standard and norms. On the next slide, I don't know why people cannot see my presentation on Zoom anymore. Something happened. Shall I continue? Okay, I'll go on then. One of the benefits or something that is new of the national quality infrastructure system, unlike the previous laws, is that it is based on principles. Now they're guiding principles, the pillars, the foundations. There are our guidelines, our guiding principles in the system, and those principles are planning. That's the first one, actually, planning. Then transparency, integrity, certainty. We're on slide 6. Thank you. Certainty, efficiency, agility, maximum advertising, best international practices, quality, coherence, sustainability, inclusion, and measurement traceability. So the foundations, that's what this is all about, the backbone of our system. This is the general guiding principle for all of the authorities, for all of the stakeholders and actors, for their actions. Now, On the next slide, this is where I break down a definition of the legitimate objectives of public interest. This is similar in all of the countries when we speak about the promotion of health or the protection of organic production or genetically modified organisms, health, food safety, education and culture, tourism, national security, climate change, protection against climate change, the rational use and exploitation of natural resources, a healthy rural and urban development, the development of public utilities and services, the protection to the right of information, which is very much connected to transparency. And in Mexico, as in many other countries, there is a concept that is called the protection of denomination of origin. Denomination of origin is related to many products that are native to a region. This is something that is also covered in international agreements. And it is something that is very relevant for Mexico, since we have several denominations of origin. It's more than 10 that are very relevant for us. It's around 15, I think, of specific denomination of origin products that are very relevant for the Mexican economy because they really boost the production and the income of those regions. So this concept is a legitimate objective of public interest for us to promote the export of those original products. On the next slide, I present the pillars of quality infrastructure, which I've already explained. Standardization, which is supported by conformity assessment and is complemented with metrology, also connected to market surveillance and with accreditation. All of those pillars are guided by a collegiate body, which is called the National Commission of Quality Infrastructure. This is the collegiate body that spearheads the national quality infrastructure system, the authorities, the civil society, private parties, industry producers, accreditation organizations, conformity assessment bodies, scientific centers, and of course the National Metrology Center, which is the National Institute for that guides the principles around this, and this is where all of the public policy decisions are made. On the next slide, small differences in the change of model. The one to the left, the 1992 model, which existed for 30 years, it was a very sparse system. The process was very slow and complex. There was no clear direction, and there was a mix of objectives and attributions. But now, after 2020, we have our current model in which the state is once again the rector, the ruler. There's a planning and a programming. There is a concurrence and coordination between the sectors. Great emphasis is given to information technologies. Something that I see is shared by others by the use of different technology platforms, as well as, well, finally, market surveillance. So this is who we are, the National Standardization Direction, the TGN for the acronym in Spanish. We regulate the amount of technical regulations, standardization, accreditation, metrology, and market surveillance at the national level. We are in charge of the whole system. And with this new legislation, our intention is to make certain that the quality infrastructure can go down to the subnational and municipality levels so that all of the authorities are included, the authorities from the three main state levels in the country. This is just some logos of some of the authorities involved that issue technical regulations. We have the Ministry of Economics, Agricultural Development, as mentioned by Monica, all of those who participate in the standardization on this work. We'll have the Ministry of Labor, the Energy Commission, Civil Aviation, Trains, Environmental Protection, Consumer Protections, and many other agencies. Here are some examples of private entities that issue standards. They are not technical regulations, they are standards that are related to quality. They promote quality matters. So here you see there's the UL, the US, it's an American body that has been formally authorized in Mexico to issue standards, Mexican standards, which is another good regulatory practice because UL has many international references. So that is the idea, to promote, to harmonize, to align our quality standards to the international ones. Each one of those entities covers different sectors, like Canacero has to do with steel industry, Normex is different industry, ANSI for the electrical products and electronicas, ONCE for the construction industry. So those are the 9 private entities. On the slide, you can see the regulatory cycle for standard development. First, the proposal is presented, a subject has to be developed, such as a technical regulation. It is assessed, it is approved through the National Quality Infrastructure Program, and then it is presented to a collegiate body. It is analyzed, and then there's a part of regulatory improvement, the subject matter of our meeting today. Interesting that in Colombia, they call it regulatory impact assessment, which is basically the same thing, but it's a good thing to know the change, the different nomenclature. Then it is presented for public consultation. It is open to feedback. 60 days are given for people to provide feedback. Then the comments are reviewed. They are discussed. A consensus is reached or not. The standard is approved. The regulation is enacted. The impact assessment review is published by the National Commission of Regulatory Improvement. And if this is favorable, then it is published in the official Gazette of the Federation. Then the regulation is enacted, and then it is implemented. And then surveillance is given to its compliance. I think I'm running out of time, right? Or do I still have time? Si me permites nada más comentar, quisiera yo
questions through email. We make sure the speakers get the questions. And for those in person, please address your questions during lunchtime, because we have still one more presentation to go.
Okay. Sí. Aquí rápidamente les presento un esquema del máximo órgano colegiado.
This is the structure of the National Commission for Quality Infrastructure. As of January 1st, 2021, the Ministry of Economics in Mexico, to which I belong, is the president of this National Commission in a permanent way, because in the previous model, the chairmanship of the National Commission, which was called the Standardization Commission, there was a turnover. Every year, a new ministry would become the chair of the commission, but we realized that was not something positive, because you would have to start from scratch every time a new agency took over the chairmanship of the commission. And so there was no continuity, there was no harmony in the long run. That is why now it is only the Ministry of Economics who's in charge. Now the next one. This is the makeup of the National Commission. There's a chairmanship, the president, the Ministry of Economics. There is a technical consultory board, which is an auxiliary body of a technical or scientific nature to provide consultancy or advisory on the matters that are decided by the commission. There's an executive secretariat or secretary, which is also our role, the General Standardization Commission. We are in charge of the logistics of the commission. And there are other entities involved, the federal entities, the scientific or private sector, and other institutions and organizations. A brief outlook of the regulations that are included now in our catalog. It's 771 Mexican official standards or norms, the technical regulations. And there's a breakdown of the sectors: industry, health, agricultural and food matters, natural resources, energy, communication, transport, and others. That's in terms of the technical standards. And now in terms of the Mexican standards, known as these standards, they're also broken down by the different organizations. In that case, we have 4,168 Mexican standards divided by different sectors and according to whoever issued them. So as you can see in the middle, you see that there's a figure that says 1,300 NMX that has to do with the Technical Committee for National Standardization Work. This is a collegiate body spearheaded by the government, by the federal authorities, unlike the rest. The other ones are private entities. This one isn't. So the 1,300 Mexican standards are issued for products that are not within the scope of the private entities. So in this sense, the government had to issue them. The authorities had to take over. That is why you see them in a separate way, but they are known as the National Committees for National Standardization. Some other figures that have to do with the current infrastructure in the country for conformity assessment. So as you can see to the left, the general denomination that is called the conformity assessment organizations, they are divided into certification bodies, inspection units, test and lab and calibration labs. This is also aligned to the international standards that you are aware of, maybe. And I see that we have authorities here as well as specific organizations for standardization and quality infrastructure. Some people are more involved with regulatory improvement. But anyway, those bodies give service to the ISO 17,000 conformity assessment parameters. And I'm referring to the 17020, 17025, the 65, 17065, which are related to those organizations that amount to a total amount, as you see to the right, almost 7,000 organizations. So this is how you see the evolution of those conformity assessment entities. Most of them, the majority of them, 95% of them correspond to private sector organizations that are accredited, they are certified, they are accredited by an accreditation unit and are approved by the regulatory authorities according to each one of the sectors. On the slide, this is how we work with international cooperation efforts with IES, ISO, with Germany, COPANT. This is just an example because the list is very long. Just to give you an idea, with the ASTM UL in Acala, Peru, we have letters of understanding, just some examples. So I feel very pleased to be here because it's a very good opportunity to get closer to one another and make certain that the list keeps on growing and the collaboration blooms. What are the pros and the cons of adapting an international standard in Mexico? As my Colombian peer said, the good and the bad of adopting international standards. Well, my opinion is very similar to what she said. The idea is to promote trade and to make certain that there are no technical obstacles or barriers to trade, to enable the use of standardized systems that are honoring the quality of goods and services. Some other pros and cons of adopting international standards. One of the benefits of the new quality infrastructure law is precisely this. And right now we are creating the bylaws in our legal framework. We have the political constitution, that is the highest level, the international agreements, federal laws, the bylaws of the federal laws, and then the secondary regulations. And in the bylaws of that law for quality infrastructure, that's where we are taking advantage of this effort to bring in provisions that have to do with the adoption of international standards. I'm about to finish. Some of the challenges that we face. Well, we want to encourage the participation of Mexico in international organizations, and also to avoid redundancy of work and to promote the implementation of MOUs, memos of understanding, or equivalency agreements, agreements of mutual acknowledgement or recognition for conformity assessment, so as to promote commercial exchange between our economies. That is why I mentioned that I feel so pleased to be here, because this is bringing us closer and we're getting to know the right people to promote this type of initiatives as a good regulatory practice, actually. And finally, implementing Platica, says here in Spanish. Platica is a platform for quality infrastructure improvement. It is a digital solution, and we are currently creating this platform so as to systematize all of the information that has to do with regulation and conformity assessment, market surveillance, etc., for decision-making purposes for public policies. On the next slide, the next steps.
And here we can see
They
some
are
next
connected
steps
to our vision and where we're heading. We wish to incorporate Mexico further in the international standardization bodies work, and it is also our intention to promote the participation of importers, exporters, and other interested parties in the activities, and to strengthen the infrastructure for quality matters, because this can promote commercial exchange.
Al final podrán ver ahí unos textos que tienen que ver con
So
buenas
here you can see some texts that have to do some good regulatory practices that were already mentioned, that have to do with the OECD, and some recommendations that have been presented by the Council on Regulatory Policy and Governance since 2012, and things that we have been considering when developing the technical regulations or the official Mexican standards, or the norms. I don't know if I should read them, but I mean, the third one is an important one. It says regulatory management tools, regulatory impact statements, stakeholder engagement, and ex post reviews of regulations, which is an ex post or an ex ante review for the regulation, and that has already been mentioned. And I'm really happy about that, because that's part of the similarities that several countries share. You know, and so we're getting closer. That's the issue, that we should get closer to harmonize the work and the development of all the standards or regulations. And this is exactly the same right here. You can see on the top what I was just mentioning, the National Program for Quality Infrastructure. This is something that is like the umbrella of all the regulations that will be developed in this calendar year and that have the public consultation period. We have the regulatory impact assessments included. So it's important also to mention that there was a transition that had to do with best practices and the regulatory impact assessment, that this was updated in 2003. We used to have a law that's called the Federal Law of Administrative Procedure and a commission called the Federal Commission for Regulatory Improvement that then created the General Law on Regulatory Improvement, the National Commission for Regulatory Improvement in 2018 when the law on regulatory improvement was enacted. This is very important because it has an impact on the 3 different levels of government, not only the federal government, but also state and municipal level governments. And lastly, we make a lot of emphasis in Chapter 28 of the current trade agreement that we have with the United States and Canada, where we basically talk about good regulatory practices. And I'm just about to finish 2 more, and that's it. Here, we see that it's important to have the regulatory impact analysis when developing the standards, because this has to do with a risk matrix or with a risk analysis that actually we've considered that has to do with the frequency and the severity of any possible damages or impacts that the regulation could cause or that the regulation is trying to solve. So this is a good regulatory practice also that we have adopted. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this last chapter that has to do with the use of quantitative data, the use of quantitative
inefficient or asymmetric markets, health or safety of people, consumer analysis of different public policy alternatives, evaluation of possible impacts on competition and foreign trade, as well as detailed analysis of the cost and benefits that the regulations imply in order to find the best alternative based on multi-criteria analysis, cost effectiveness, cost benefit, considering in addition qualitative elements to allow dimension properly address problems. Y finalmente, pues nuestra guía principal, pues también es atender a los.
And this is our main guideline at the end of the day that would like to cover all the sustainable development goals of the UN. We are basing this on SDG 9 of the Ministry of the Economy is based on that, because these are cross-sectional works. We have an impact on other goals, but basically on SDG 9 that has to do with industry and building resilient infrastructures and promoting them. And so that would be my participation for today. And it's a pleasure to be able to share this standardization and regulatory change that Mexico is undergoing at this moment. So thank you very much. Thank you, Monica, Daniel, and Raul once again.
During lunchtime, sorry, Jose Marcio, and for those who are virtual, we'll make sure the speakers get. Marco, I know you're anxious to come here, so it's your turn, our final presentation. Thank you very much. So Marcos Aurélio Lima de Oliveira is the coordinator of the National Quality Infrastructure Policy at Instituto Nacional de Metrologia, Qualidade e Tecnologia em Metro. This is our final presentation of the 3 days, so it's an honor to have you here with me. Please give the example 15 minutes, because we have lunch.
Yes.
And then we
I try.
But thank you very much to all the speakers this morning, and Marcos, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon now, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to give opportunity for us to show our project in Brazil, the transformation of quality infrastructure in our country. Like my friend Jorge Casazeira, I will speak Portuguese, okay? Então, let's go. Antes de falar pouco, eu tenho
So
15 minutos.
before starting my presentation, to talk about our project of transformation of the quality infrastructure in Brazil, it would be interesting to ask the following question. Why is Inmetro leading this process in Brazil? Because Inmetro is a single institution in the world that has pros and cons. The positive side is that it's very difficult to manage an institution with several activities. On the other hand, it's very important because once you have an integration of 70% of the three pillars of the institutions that make up a system of quality infrastructure is within our institution. So in that sense, Inmetro has been leading this work, and I'm very, very happy and grateful. Coincidentally, the event's agenda put me to speak at the end after hearing different interesting presentations from the standardization bodies from Colombia and the quality infrastructure law from Mexico, and after hearing from ANSI in the United States, a great partner for us, and ABNT. In the first part of our morning, we had an interesting approach from Colombia and Brazil regarding this regulatory model and how it can work. So I think the goal of our meeting of these 3 days meets what we really want. And with that, I have inserted this slide that was not previously in my presentation because we are talking about good regulatory practices and regulatory convergence. Back in 2007, 15 years ago, we have published and approved a Brazilian guide on good regulatory practices. At that time, we had a Brazilian committee of regulation, a committee that gathered the main 32 regulatory agencies like the Telecommunications Agency, the Brazilian Health Vigilance Agency, one from oil, electric, energy. So the main agencies of Brazil were part of that project. And throughout 2 years during 2008 and 2009, we've conducted 10 workshops for both public and private institutions. Of course, this document has to be transformed and modernized. And with that, I'm already posing a new challenge for our group of the coalition. So why do not have a good guide on regulatory practices for the Americas? That might be an interesting exercise, especially because of the summit that is discussing these good practices. So we could also work in that sense. Another thing that I would like to point out is that we might ask how Inmetro is planning to strengthen its regulatory and quality infrastructure framework. So since 2020, our president, Marcos Heleno, and together with us, we have developed our targets during 3 years, from 2021 to 23. So our proposal is that the main themes that we should approach is the institution Inmetro to be organized. So we have organized ourselves through our strategic plan. Then we went to work on our structure, our regulatory structure. We have worked on that as well. And now we're at the last stage, which is to really create our infrastructure policy. And those are the main challenges of that quality infrastructure policy. These are the challenges for the next 3 years. So we have published and approved the strategic plan in 2021. We have approved back in February this year. In 49 years, it was the first time that the president of the country was part of a budget meeting of a regulatory structure. So that shows the importance of this theme. So we now have the goal to propose and launch the public consultation regarding the national quality infrastructure policy, and that is planned for August this year in 3 months. And then we will move on to the second stage of our regulatory structure, which is the implementation of that regulatory structure. I'm not going to talk about our strategic planning due to the shortage of time, but here are some of the objectives. These are the objectives of InMetro, and I would like to highlight the first and the last one, because the first one shows that InMetro wants to work closely to the productive sector, proposing solutions with emphasis on what is our responsibility, which is the quality infrastructure. And the last bullet point is a strategic goal, which is to re-signify the brand InMetro among society. I'm very happy to be here and see different colleagues, but for those who are not Brazilian, I want to explain this resignification, this better understanding of what InMetro stands for. Since 1991, InMetro has been conducting a survey within society every 2 years with the productive and private sectors and with society in general. The last survey that we have conducted shows the same average in the last 20 years, and 85% of Brazilian society knows the brand InMetro. And of those 85% of the Brazilian society, 88% trust the brand. That goes to show that this is very important data, so that we can look at these this last goal, which is to resignify the brand, to maintain the high standard of recognition within society, but in another way regarding the 4.0 society. So this is a very important point for all of us.
Okay, so now I would like to talk a little bit about our experience in creating our regulatory framework. Like our friend from Mexico mentioned, and again, this is a testimony of the convergence of the discussions we have here. But first, I would like to comment on our experience. It was a very enriching moment, and I've been coordinating this work. And when we gathered, we brought some people from the government and from the private sector together. And we sat in a similar room like this, and we did a brainstorming session. How are we going to start? How are we going to create an in-metro regulatory framework. So discussions last all day, and at the end of the day, we've adopted the concept of a country's constitution. What is a constitution? It's a document in which you established your principles and your guidelines. And it's interesting because on that day, we saw the Brazilian constitutions that have very few articles and the other Brazilian constitutions that have, I don't even know how many articles, but I know that there are many. And we were discussing, what do we want? Do we want a regulatory framework that has the principles similar to an American constitution, or do we want a regulatory framework that's more similar to a Brazilian constitution? We cannot have as few as the American Constitution does, but never as many as the Brazilian ones. So we created a regulatory framework with that mindset. We want to have principles and guidelines. And these principles and guidelines would bring or make this regulatory framework, would bring elements to strengthen both society and the sector or the industry that is responsible for producing either a good, a product, or a service. And the idea is for society to acquire products and services that have the highest level of quality. This is the work that we did. And now we have a vision, we have the objectives inside this regulatory framework, and we have 10 principles and 12 guidelines established here. So based on these principles and guidelines, as of February this year, the regulatory process inside Inmetro started to evolve. Of course, implementation is not going to happen overnight. And in the approval process of our regulatory framework, we have established a 5-year period for the implementation of the new regulatory framework. Talking specifically about Inmetro, but in Brazil overall, this concept that we have included in our regulatory framework is an innovation, because we have created a governance committee that will implement our regulatory framework. And this is a cultural aspect, not only in Brazil, but in many Latin American countries. Usually inside committees, we have more representatives from the government and fewer representatives from the private sector. But this is a different committee. We have 50% of the seats being taken by the government and 50% of the seats of the committee are for representatives of the private sector. And we cannot invite all the different industries, otherwise the committee would have 700 people. So Brazil have different confederations that basically combines different segments. So we will have a representative from industry, one representative from agribusiness, one from trade, and one from services, and standardization institutions like ABNT, and institutions representing service providers for conformity assessment. And on the government side, some government agencies. So it's a balanced committee, and it's a consulting committee that will support Inmetro. So our president, when he makes a decision to create a regulation for a product or service, can make this decision based on the reports prepared by this committee. So this is also an innovation, and this committee is divided into 3 phases: a development phase, a project, a pilot phase, and an implementation phase. As we heard from our president on Monday, currently we have 300 regulations, 150 focused for legal metronomy, and 150 regulations focused on products and services. But in conclusion of this part of the presentation, I would like to highlight that our regulatory framework is basically empowering the regulated sector. This is also not a novelty for us. And this is new because from now on, in Metro, as soon as we establish a technical regulation, and if that technical regulation is not aligned with the principles and the guidelines that are part of our regulatory framework, any industry can raise their hand and say, Mr. Inmetro, you are not complying to the regulatory framework that you approved. So the private sector, the regulated sector, is empowered even more. And this is another element that's part of our proposal. I'm going to try to speed up because I'm already over 15 minutes. But very quickly, I'll try to talk about some concepts regarding our policies. So right now, we are discussing and we are building our national policy for quality infrastructure. As mentioned by our colleague from Colombia today, the policy that we're working on is not a policy from Inmetro, is not a policy from the government. It's a country policy. It's a state policy. So this is why we are building such policy. And the main or the key factor here for the success of the project of a national policy for quality infrastructure is the fact that the private sector is helping us design the project. To give you an idea, from January 2022 until today, we have had meetings with 150 agents from the productive sector coming from different segments: agribusiness, health, services, electronics, mining, gas and oil, or oil and gas, sorry. So we are listening what several agents from the productive sector has to say so we can strengthen our policy. Because regardless of the government or who is in charge, this is a policy that will be long lasting, regardless of who is in office. That's why this is being built as a state policy. To give you an idea of how this is organized in Brazil, when we think about a quality infrastructure system, as I mentioned before, we have clear divisions. We have metrology, we have standardization, we have accreditation, the regulatory framework, and our national quality policy is a state policy, like I mentioned before. So we have the government, we have in the middle pretty much all the important actors from the private sector, other players from the government, and the academia as well, because it is very important to have contributions from the academia and from our international partners. We have a very strong relationship with NIST here in the United States. Actually, our president is not here today with us because he's on NIST conducting a visit, and with our German partners, the PTB, and GIZ. So that strengthens even more this idea of having a robust, reliable system that will benefit society. I will go a little bit quicker over this part, but I just would like to highlight the importance of the quality infrastructure concept. Because if we look back, and still today, our pillars were very strongly established to standardize, to think about metrology concepts and testing, accreditation, but they were not connected. They were not working together so we can have more effectiveness. So we can be sure that a service provided by any industry is truly reliable. And our friend from Mexico just talked about a similar thing that's happening in Mexico, is the inclusion of the concept of governance. So our intention with this modern concept of quality infrastructure is to make the four pillars work within a structure of governance. We are working on these documents. The four documents you see here have already been prepared. Some of our colleagues are helping develop these documents that are being produced by UNIDO. And if you have the chance to access their website, these are very important and interesting documents when we think about the concept of quality infrastructure. But what is this all about? What are the contributions? What are our objectives when we think about technical regulation, metrology, accreditation, conformative assessment, and market follow-up? I usually call this system like an orchestra. You have a maestro who is conducting the system. You have the different members playing different instruments because an orchestra is comprised by several types of instruments, and there's an audience. If the orchestra plays for the orchestra members play for themselves, and the audience who is there to listen to the song, who has a certain expectation from the songs that an orchestra will play. If the orchestra plays just for themselves, it's a pointless show. So we expect that the results that are generated by the system are perceived and trusted, perceived as useful and are trusted by society. And more than that, it's important that society uses these results for their decision-making process. I want this product and not that one. And this is important for our greater goal, which is trust. A product that is produced by a quality infrastructure policy is, in our opinion, Brazil, a product that is called trust. This is what a quality infrastructure system needs to deliver to society. So our policy has a vision with different objectives, measures, and schedules. Our work methodology started with the review of documents, and we used Mexico as one of our benchmarks because of the policy in Mexico. We also did benchmarking with the US and Germany. We talked to 12 people in Brazil, 12 experts in Brazil from different segments, including former ministries. And we organized 6 workshops. And one of them was essential because it focused on sustainability. So now, before the end of June, and you can see that between quotation marks, we are going to do a public consultation, but this is a different version of a public consultation. We'll basically use questionnaires. Usually, a public consultation includes standard or a technical regulation so people can give their opinion. This will be the second step. But first, we want to get the largest number possible of information from society. I think in 15, 20 days, this will be sent to everyone. Even you, if you wish to participate in this public consultation, we will be able to send this questionnaire to all of you, because the more information we gather, the better our national quality infrastructure policy will be. I will skip this part because of time constraints, but this is just to highlight the importance of mutual or multilateral recognition agreements for accreditation, quality assessment. So Brazil today complies or is a signatory of all the agreements for standardization, metrology, and accreditation. We are part of all these agreements. And our goal is to improve the coordination and integrate the system so we are fully aligned in order to conclude this work. And to end my presentation, I'm not going to read all the highlights that we have selected for you, but I would just mention a few. As Cajazeiras mentioned before, in Brazil, we have A, B, and T. So in Brazil, we only have one entity that is recognized by the Brazilian government as a standardization institution. In Metro is also a single voice. It's the only institution in charge of metrology. And for accreditation, we only have a single institution. And all this work that we are doing for the past, we have been doing for the past 2.5 years, it's a work that's being built with the participation of society. It's a work that is being designed with the participation of the private sector. I can only speak on behalf of Brazil, of course, but I know a little bit about the rest of the world. But usually when a regulation is published, there is a regulation agency that places that regulation for a public consultation, and then society can speak up. This is not what we are doing. We are listening to what the society has to say before we start a public consultation process. We understand that it is essential for Brazil to have a quality infrastructure policy for our economic growth, for the development of our industries. And so we are aligned with the global concept of a 4.0 economy. So the main highlight of our work regarding the construction of these policies and all the systems that we have presented to you today is a very strong participation of the production sector in the design of the project. I apologize if I took a little bit more time than I was supposed to, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Very good presentation. I guess, Renee, in the afternoon, you have to add a question on how to not to fail to the 15 minutes challenge. My suggestion. But thank you very much. I think we concluded a very productive morning. All of you, thank you for being here in person. I think that makes a lot of difference for all of us. One of the intentions of this week was to get everyone together, get to know each other, look into each other's eyes. So thank you very much. And before I conclude this external session, please come back. Those who do not need to be here at 1 p.m., come back at 2:30 p.m. for our final reception. And last but not least, all the team worked really hard for this week to happen. But I would like us to recognize one person in special, Christian, who is back there, who is not in the microphone. So he's really the responsible for everything to run smoothly this week. Thank you. You get your sleep time from tomorrow on. So thank you very much. We have the lunch waiting for us. For those who need to come back, we have 25 minutes.